Hello and welcome, this is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to use a fall stamp set for the holidays. I'm using this new pumpkin and spice stamp set from Pajama Crafter Stamps. I'm excited to be a new design team member of theirs. So I'm going to use this as a fall or to create a fall card first, and then I'm going to alter it to create a holiday card. So the first thing that I do anytime I have a clear stamp set is I take a white eraser, rub that stamping surface to remove any possible manufacturing residue. I find it just helps that stamp to take ink a little bit better. And I always do the entire set, so I know if I've used one stamp from a set that the whole thing is done. I'm using my Misti stamping tool here, and I'm stamping on some distress watercolor cardstock. I like using it for watercolor because of the nice bright white, and I get nice true colors. So I position those stamps on that piece of distress watercolor cardstock, use my embossing powder tool on there. That way my embossing powder is likely only going to stick to the ink and not any of the areas around it. And if by chance it does stick to other areas, it's going to be minimal. It'll be easy to brush them off. So I stamp it a couple times, and by using that Misti stamping tool, it makes it really easy to stamp multiple times in the same area. Clean off my stamp set and then decide to leave it in there because I realized I was going to be using it again anyways. So for the first card here, I'm going to be using some Vintage Photo Distress Glaze for my embossing. It's just going to give it a really nice warmth to that fall look. The sentiment I chose is pumpkin spice and everything nice, but there's several different sentiments perfect for fall to use with this stamp set. I always love when stamp sets have images as well as sentiments that work with those images. I use my embossing tool to melt that powder, and then I'm going to watercolor it with some Distress watercolor crayons. So I'll often use my Distress refills for doing watercolor, and I really like them because you get a nice bright translucent color, but I also really like the Distress watercolor crayons. There's no mess to them, but you get a tiny little bit more opacity to them because of the pigment in the crayon. So I'm going to start off with using my carved pumpkin, and I'm using all of the crayons I'm using today are in set 4. I wanted to try keep all of the colors that I was using to one set and managed to do that. So I'm starting off with the pumpkins, coloring them with that carved pumpkin. So I first get a little bit of color off the crayon, do that light coat over the whole pumpkin, and then I go back, and as you take a little bit more color off the crayon, that water kind of seeps into the crayon, and you get a little bit more pigment and a little bit less water. Those pieces or those bits after the first little brush or wash of color, I use for the shading area. So that'll be towards the lower part of the pumpkin, towards the stem. And I did both the big pumpkin as well as the small one. The next color I'm using is Shabby Shutters, and I'm using that for the greenery. Now, because I heat embossed this here, there are a lot of leaves that don't actually have any open areas for watercoloring. So I'm only watercoloring those that have some open areas to see that color. So most of those leaves are going to be brown, which works fine for the fall. But then I'm going to add a little bit of color to some of the areas just to give them a little bit of foliage color. For some of the larger leaves, I'm using some multiple colors so that they look like leaves that are turning in the fall. So I first did that Shabby Shutters in some of the areas, then I did a little bit of that carved pumpkin, and then I'm adding some festive berries. I'm also using that festive berries for some of the florals. I start off with just a little light wash of color over the whole flower, and then I go back in, get a little bit more pigment from that crayon, and put it darker towards the center of the flower. So we get a variation of color between the petals in the center and the outside of those petals. Just gives it a little bit of visual dimension. So once I'm done with those florals, I can start working on the surface below that cup and the pumpkins. So I'm using some ground espresso for that, making sure that it's heavier and that we have more shading below the cup as well as the pumpkins, and then blending my way out to no color at all. You could, if you wanted, blend the whole background, if you wanted the whole background to have color. I tend to think it looks a little bit more interesting having a bit of color around the image and then blending out to nothing. So for my cup, I'm using some tea dye, and I'm not adding a whole lot of color to it. I want it to be pretty light. There's going to be a little bit heavier color around the outside edges, and then I'm blending to barely any color on the inside. I want the focal point of this image to be those pumpkins, the foliage. I don't necessarily want it to be that cup, so I'm keeping it really, really light so it doesn't draw attention. For the whipped cream, you could leave it just white as it is, but I think it always looks better with just a little bit of of color. So I'm using the scattered straw. Most of that color, I'm being really light with the color, but most of it is going around the outside edges, a little bit where the folds of the whipped cream are. Then I went back to that tea dye and did the rim of the cup because I realized that I had missed that area. So I added that. So the brush that I'm using is a water brush that has water right in the handle, so it makes it very little mess. So that paper towel that I have to my right, I'm using to clean off excess color as well as change the colors. I can always squeeze the handle to flush water through my brush to change the colors. Now, I wasn't originally going to do any color on my background behind the cup, but I just thought it needed a little bit. I didn't want to grab a different set of Distress watercolor crayons. Like I said before, I wanted to keep it with this one set. And the only blue in here was that Chip Sapphire. It could be fairly dark. So what I did was use that crayon to color on my glass surface. You're not going to get very much color. It's not a surface that grips the color to get a lot of it, but it has enough so that I can add water to it and just get a hint of that blue on the background. If you wanted, you could use a different set and use a lighter blue, but this works perfectly for what I had intended for it. Now, when I go to change it to this design to a holiday version, what I will end up doing is doing this before I do any of the foliage. Had I thought about doing this, or had I known I was going to do a background or color on the background, I would have done this ahead of time. Then you don't have to be nearly as careful because you don't have color in those areas. And that blue is light enough that any other color is going to be darker and would easily be able to be colored over top of it. So you'll see me do it in a little bit different way for the second card. For the straws or the little sticks in the drink, I'm just doing those with that carved pumpkin, so it matches the pumpkins below. I realized that I had missed a little area of sky, so I went and filled that in, as well as a little leaf, filling that in as well. Now, one of the bonuses to heat embossing this image is I can go and work right beside different areas with different colors, and that heat embossing adds a ridge to it, so I don't have to worry about my colors blending and bleeding with each other. If you just use regular ink or regular permanent ink that you can watercolor with and not heat embossing, you would definitely want to make sure that one area is dry before you go and watercolor right beside it. Otherwise, those colors are going to blend and bleed together. So to add just a little bit of extra texture aside from my embossing to this image, I'm using some pumpkin spice interference pad and I'm watercoloring over top of that pumpkin. We're going to still see the watercolor distress crayon underneath, that watercoloring underneath. We're just adding a thin layer and it's just going to add a little bit of that beautiful interference. So interference inks have two properties to them. They look one way on white or light cardstock and a completely different way on dark or black cardstock. So if you just use the pad on dark cardstock, you're going to see the interference color, which in this case is purple. If you're going to do it on white, you're going to see the orange that you see here. But when you tilt it into the light, even when you have that light color, you still see that interference. So when we tilt that piece into the light, it shimmers with some purple. So it's absolutely pretty. Are absolutely beautiful. And even though I watercolored with it, you're not going to get quite as much of the shimmer, but you're still going to see some of it. So that mat that I did my pumpkin spice interference ink around, I trimmed down to 4 inches by 5¼ inches, gluing that to an A2 card base. My image, once it was dry, I trimmed down to 3¾ inches by 5 inches. So you see that mat around it, and it's going to blend perfectly with that pumpkin with that little bit of purple shimmer. It just adds a little hint of texture as well as something for the light to catch when you tilt it into the light. To add just a touch more shimmer to it, I'm adding some Stickles to the centers of the flowers and a little bit on the whipped cream. I'm not covering that whole whipped cream with those Stickles, just a tiny little bit around the edges. The Stickles that I use is an opalescent color, so there's no color to it. You can see whatever color underneath it, but it just adds that glitter and that sparkle. So now we're ready to change up our image. So I have another piece of distress watercolor paper, my pumpkin and spice image. I'm going to be using the Citrus and Scarlet Blooms stamp set as well as the Polar Bear Pals stamp set. So the sentiment I'm using is from the Polar Bear Pals stamp set, and it just says warm winter wishes. I thought that one worked perfectly with a nice warm drink for the holidays. And from the Citrus and Scarlet Blooms stamp set, I'm going to be using the poinsettia stamp, the little individual floral stamp, as well as a couple of the leaves. But I'm going to be doing that on a separate piece of watercolor cardstock because I'm going to do some fussy cutting with them. And we're going to cover those areas where those pumpkins are. So once again, just like that first image, I'm going with VersaMark ink, inking that whole stamp set up. I went and I rubbed that pumpkin thinking I would remove the ink from it so it wouldn't even emboss, but it actually still, the embossing powder still stuck to those areas. So just ignore that step that you see me doing there because it's not going to make any difference anyways. You're still going to have that ink on there and that embossing powder is still going to stick to it. So once I'm done stamping that image, I can clean my stamp set up, and I'm just using a damp cloth to clean that ink off, put that away. And for this particular image, I'm using some gold embossing powder. I'm taking a soft brush and I'm just removing those pumpkins. You could leave them there because they do get covered. However, one of the areas that I'm going to be using, I'm using a little foam pop dot to raise that poinsettia, and I don't want to see the pumpkin underneath it if you happen to be able to. So just to avoid any possible chance of that, I just use that soft brush to remove that pumpkin. I also use that brush to remove any embossing powder that might be sticking elsewhere. You definitely want to be doing that before you heat emboss. Then we're ready to melt that powder. I did this one in gold because I thought it would be just beautiful for the holidays. You could also do like a silver. I always think with holiday cards and creations that metallics really just take them to the next level. If you don't want to, you could always just use a different color of distress glaze, or even black embossing powder would be nice as well. But I really love the look of the gold with it. So this is the second stamp that I'm going to be using to alter this image. This one is the Citrus and Scarlet Blooms stamp set. So once again, I'm using that white eraser to remove any possible manufacturing residue on the surface of that stamp, brushing any of those eraser bits off so that I don't have those interfering with my stamped image. And I don't need this entire piece of distressed watercolor cardstock, so I'm going to be focusing towards the bottom so that I have the rest of this cardstock basically to be using for a future project. So you can see me moving them around. There doesn't need to be a lot of space between them. I'm going to be fussy cutting, so I don't have dies that I need to make sure are not going to infringe on other pieces. They are going to be fussy cut, so they can be as close as you want them to be. So once again, I'm inking them with VersaMark ink, and then I stamp that twice just to make sure I have a nice clear image, and then I put those stamps away after cleaning them off. Heat embossing them with the exact same embossing powder as the first image. I want them to match. If there's any embossing powder sticking anywhere else, you definitely want to take that off once again before doing that heat embossing. So these are going to be watercolored the same way as my image is. I'm using that same set as my last card. So I'm using set 4 that has the perfect colors in it for what I need to do. But like I said before, I know now that I want to do a little bit of color to that background. So I'm going to do that first. That way that I don't have to worry about going around each one of those foliage pieces. I can go right over top of it. The colors that I'm going to be using to watercolor those areas are going to be darker than this pale blue. So I don't have to worry about that changing the color or altering the color or infringing on that. And it's much easier and quicker. You can see how quick this background is done this time compared to last time because I'm not needing to go around the different areas. Now, if you wanted, you could use more of this chip sapphire color to deepen that color of that background. And just like my first background, I have that color, just a hint of it around the image, and then I fade it out to nothing. Again, it's just a personal preference. I like that look. If you want, you could do that color all the way to the edge of your cardstock, and that would look fantastic as well. But when I'm doing watercoloring, I just tend to prefer this look to it. So just like my last one, I'm using that ground espresso to do the area below the cup. Once again, being darker right below that cup and then fading out to nothing. Very similar in style to how I did the blue behind the cup. I like just to have it fade to nothing. I want that focus to be the cup, the foliage, the different pieces that I have on there. I don't want the focus to be the surrounding area. I'm going to be using the festive berries for my poinsettia. And you can see that when I'm doing this, I'm swapping back and forth between the two images. If I'm using one color, I'm going to be doing all of the areas in that color for both of the images, rather than doing one complete image first and then going back and doing a different complete or doing the other piece. That way everything can dry all at the same time. I just find it a little bit more efficient this way. So when I do that poinsettia, I take that Festive Berries and I go over the whole thing, just a little bit of a wash. And then I go in and do each one of those poinsettia petals, making sure that I have more ink or more pigment towards the base of the petal than the tip. And then those petals that are behind others, those are a little bit darker than the ones that are in the front. Now I'm going to add different texture to these images as well. So last card I used the pumpkin spice interference pads. For this one, I'm going to be using a new set of metallic pads from Lisa Horton Crafts. This is for winter 2025. So this one has 3 different colors in it. It has mulled wine, winter fir, and frozen icicles, and they all have a metallic finish to them, and they're just beautiful colors. But I'm going to be pulling those out in just a moment. I'm just grabbing or just putting a layer of the Distress Watercolor crayon underneath where I want those pads to be, and those colors are going to blend together. So this is the set here. Like I said, there's 3 different colors. I'm going to be using all 3 colors in this card. So the first one here is that mulled wine. When it comes to coloring over top of my Distress Watercolor crayon for that poinsettia, I don't need to be quite as careful with this as I did with my first coloring because I already have that base color underneath them. I'm starting where that ink is heaviest and blending out, but we're going to get some of, or the look of some of that Distress Watercolor crayon, and then some of the metallic shine. We're not going to have metallic shine over that entire poinsettia. It's just going to have just a little bit to it. I always love, personally, when there's just kind of a hint of that. To me, less is more, and it makes it look more interesting. I don't want the entire poinsettia to be metallic. I just want it to have some metallic hints to it. So then I go in and do a few areas of the cup. I did those straws there. Next, I'm going to go in with the winter fir, and I'm going to go over top of those leaves. For those leaves, I used evergreen bough, and it was just a little bit too tealy turquoise for me for the look that I was going for. But so by going over that with the winter fir, that changes the color a little bit, and I like it just a little bit better than that evergreen bough. So I went over top of those bigger leaves. I'm doing those pieces first before my image because those are the ones that I want to dry first, because I'm going to be doing the fussy cutting around them. So I do want to give those a little bit of extra time to dry. So I do the images that I'm going to do the fussy cutting first, and then I go in and do the images around my cup so that I don't have to worry about the pieces around the cup. I'm not doing any fussy cutting there. So when I'm watercoloring with the metallic pads, I'm doing the same technique as I do with the watercolor crayons, or even when I'm using the reinkers. I start where I want that color to be darkest and then blend my way out. If by chance I still have too much color on my brush, I'll use that paper towel to my right to remove the excess color from my brush, and then I will remove color from that watercolor cardstock. So again, I don't want the entire surface to be metallic. I just want the darker areas to have that metallic shine, and then the lighter areas just to have a little bit of a hint of that color. So the last color from this set I'm using is that frozen icicle. So it's a nice bright blue. This could have also been used for the background, but I didn't want to have any touch of metallic for that background. I also had flip-flopped back and forth as to whether I was going to use it, but I thought it would make a nice color for the florals in this image. So I go over each of those florals with just a clean brush, just water, and then I go in with that frozen icicles just in the center of the flowers, and because that flower is wet, it starts to blend and bleed all on its own. Then I clean my brush off, and then I go and blend it just a tiny little bit more. So I have a concentration of that color in the center of the flower, and it blends to almost nothing on the outside of those petals. For the cup, I'm using that tea dye, and just like my pumpkin spice one, I'm doing it really light around the edges and then kind of fading to almost nothing towards the center of the cup. Again, my focal point here is the foliage, the florals. I don't want the focal point to be the cup, or I don't want it to be too dark. You could, if you wanted to make it a little bit darker, but it's just not the look that I was going for. So I thought it would be fun for the whipped cream to kind of do like a peppermint striped look to it. So I went in first off with that scattered straw, just adding a little bit of shading and dimension to the outside edges. Then I went back in with that mulled wine metallic pad, just doing some stripes in that straw or in that whipped cream. So I like the look of it. I think the mulled wine is a little bit too almost has a brown tone to it. I think it might have looked a little bit better if it was more of a bright red. It might have looked a little bit more like peppermint stripes, but I do like that it adds just a different look to that whipped cream. Just gives it a little bit of flair to it, if you will. So after doing that, my image is pretty much done. So I set that aside to dry. I'm using that mulled wine pad to ink around my mat for my card. So that was trimmed to 4 inches by 5¼ inches before inking that cardstock. Set that aside to dry. And while I'm waiting for those things to dry, I can do my fussy cutting. So I have my detail scissors here from Spellbinders. This works perfectly for doing all of that fussy cutting. So I'm going right around the outside edge of my embossed image. And as I'm doing my cutting, you can see that my scissors don't really change position too much. It's the cardstock that changes position. So that's the secret to doing fussy cutting, is not really moving your scissors too much. You move the paper, not the scissors. And when I have longer areas to do the fussy cutting, I'm using the whole blade as I'm closing my blade, I'm moving that cardstock to it. And then if I have another area that has a longer area to cut, I open that blade up. When it comes down to the poinsettia, you don't really have to worry about that too much because each one of those edges are fairly short, so you don't have to worry about that quite as much. But that's the way you get some nice, clean, smooth edges. It's when you're stopping and starting cutting that you end up getting some jaggedy edges to it. I also, when I'm cutting and doing fussy cutting, I tend to angle my scissors so the bottom blade is a little bit below the image and the top blade is just slightly outside of that embossed line. Now, if it was not an embossed line, I wouldn't have to worry quite as much about the lines. But when it comes to the embossing, I don't want to be cutting into that embossing. I want to be cutting just slightly outside of it. If it was just an inked stamp or just permanent ink, you could cut into that line. It wouldn't make any difference. The other thing that I would do too, if it was just ink, is I would use a little bit of that ink around the outside of the image after it's cut, especially if it's a different color from the white cardstock. It just finishes it off a little bit nicer. Because this is embossed, I'm not going to do that because I'm not going to be adding VersaMark ink around the edge of each thing and then embossing it. That's just a recipe for disaster for me. So after doing my fussy cutting, I trimmed down my image piece to 3¾ inches by 5 inches. And now we're ready to add this to an A2 card base. So I add my mat down there first. I'm using some Barely Art glue with a fine line bottle, so this is going to work perfectly for gluing everything together. The only thing I add is a foam pop dot underneath that poinsettia. I wanted to give that a little bit of dimension. So with my base pieces down, I can lay out my fussy cut pieces to make sure that the design that I have in my head is going to work on the surface. Most of the time it does, but there's the odd time that there's something that I didn't think about, or I end up just not really loving the look of it. And by having an acrylic block on top of my surface, I can see right through. I can see how it's going to look on that surface, and I can move my design to the side so I don't have to remember where I had put everything. In this case, it's only 4 pieces. It would be easy to remember, but if there's something that there's a lot of pieces too, sometimes it's hard to remember exactly where you would put everything. So I glued down those leaves flat as well as the floral that has the blue. And then I add a thin foam pop dot behind that poinsettia. It's just going to raise it a tiny little bit, not a lot of dimension. You could do a thicker foam pop dot if you wanted to add a lot of dimension. And then just like my last one, I'm doing some Stardust Stickles on that whipped cream, just a little bit on the lighter areas and in the center of those florals. Then I add some Platinum Stickles in the center of that poinsettia. So that's going to coordinate beautifully with that gold embossing, and it also is going to give a center to that poinsettia that is just a little bit different from the rest of the card. So I let that dry for probably about 15-20 minutes, and this is the result. And I absolutely love being able to use the same stamp set with a couple additional ones to create a card that is for a completely different season. It's just a fun thing to be able to do this and extend the use of your seasonal stamps. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate all the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.